Hello friends, we have this new series that started in the last month, and it focuses upon 19th century fiction, short fiction, and of course there will be some writers who emerged in the 20th century but whose mental makeup was there from the 19th century itself. So these will be covered under this series, and our job is to focus upon not the authors of the short story, but the short stories themselves as texts. In the previous month, that is in April, all the four of us, members of the team, gave lectures on the form of the story, short story, and from this month onwards, we have already discussed two short stories, and today is the third one. And the speaker, the expert for the third story, which will be used, as a text, is Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janaki Devi Mahavidyalaya, University of Delhi, and Memorial College, University of Delhi. And she is an expert on the 19th century generally, whether the 19th century is of England or of India. And she has a fine knowledge also of the feminist texts in the that shaped in the 19th century. So we look forward to this lecture, and I would request her to before I request her to begin her discussion, let me pose one or two questions, maybe one question only. The author is Kate Chopin, and she's an American woman, and she has a kind of sensibility, and she says less than she actually expresses, and she expresses more. She expresses subtly, and she has that fine, insightful gaze, on the human behavior, and the gaze is of a woman who understands more than she shows. So these are the points that I would like Professor Payal Nagpal to touch upon, or at least keep in mind, so that we understand the text that she is explaining even better than she otherwise would render the text. So, Professor Payal Nagpal, please say something about the writer and the short story.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. I think this is like so well put that some of the important aspects of Kate Chopin's style of writing, I think you've already put that, very concisely about how she's, there are many levels at which I think her stories operate. One is, of course, the ostensible level at which one is looking at a plot, so to say. But there are so many layers beneath that, and that is where I think she brings in her own, craft as a writer, where one is allowed, in a sense, to enter the text, to enter the short story, and to understand what these different layers are, and how they reflect, the condition of the woman in the 19th century, and the way in which the world was also changing, which meant that these contradictions not only belong to the writer, but they also belong to the times. And it is with this in view that we are going to look at Kate Chopin's story, The Story of an Hour. So, since we are talking a little bit about her life, it's interesting to map Kate Chopin's life, and because she is a writer whose own life, in a sense, also kind of her life's experiences get reflected, in a sense, in what she's writing. So, she was born Catherine O'Flaherty, and she was born in 1850, so mid-19th century, and she was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and studied at initially part of the boarding at Sacred Heart Academy, but she had to take a break for 2 years, and then she joined as a day scholar. One of her father was one of the civic leaders, and he was writing the first train, that came over the Gasconade Bridge, and that collapsed, and he died. So this is an interesting piece of information because it connects directly to the story that we are going to discuss today. The reason why we're discussing Chopin's life here is because the way in which it's also mapping the life of a woman who grew up mid-19th century, and who was also aware of the way in which the new woman was emerging, especially in the 80s and 90s. This little incident about the train, of course, tells us something about her life, but more importantly also tells us about the way in which the fact that it was the first train that came in the area. So it tells us about the way in which modernity and modernization was rapidly taking place. A very interesting aspect is that she was also kind of brought up by her great grandmother Victoria Worden Shalwell, who taught her, as her biographer Emily Todd says, French music, clear thinking, and scandalous gossip about St. Louis women of the past. So, which meant that St. Louis society was fast changing. So, apart from all this, there were women who were bold, and what was very bold here was the act of the great grandmother in kind of narrating all these stories to Kate Chopin. So. Another very important aspect about her life is that in her growing up years, there were no couples in the house, there were no married couples. So, to quote Emily Toth here, but there were no married couples in the house until Kate was 16 after the Civil War. Kate O'Flaherty grew up surrounded by single and very independent women, both at home and at the Sacred Heart Academy, where the sisters were famous for their intellectual rigor. So, again, this is important and very interesting, because we are looking at Kate Chopin as a writer who is able to, her streak of, independence, and the way she is able to give space to the kind of struggles and contradictions that women faced in their personal lives within the form of the short story. So, she was married to Oscar Chopin, and she had 6 children. Her husband's father, being a plantation owner, grew cotton. However, as he suffered serious debt, they, of course, after the marriage, she moved to New Orleans and then came back to St. Louis. As the business failed, there was a huge debt, and she ended up running a general store. So, again, through all these years, as we can see that, there were a number of children that she bore, and so she was in this, as I said, a perpetual state of pregnancy. So she spent a lot of time alone and took long walks, and in a sense, she is a writer who had the ability to have that dialogue with the self. Due to debt, she also shifted to, a smaller town, Clucheville and Natchitoches Parish in Louisiana, where, you had parish and you didn't have counties there. So, it's only after her husband's death finally that she returns to the Society of St. Louis. And in terms of her style of writing, she was greatly influenced by Maupassant's also European writers, especially Zola, which means that in her writing we see a deep connection between the characters that she is creating and painting in the short story and their environment in which they grow up, in which they mature and evolve, and at the same time there is her own environment in which she is present as a writer. So, she wrote several short stories, Wiser Than a God being her first one. She published Bay of Folk in 1894 and A Night in Acadie 1897. These were collections of short stories, and she also published novels, and one of her most famous ones being The Awakening. So, she died in 1904. As a writer, she held salons at home. There were writers who visited her. She was very, very friendly with a lot of journalists, had a lot of admirers. There's a story that she wrote about an affair between a planter and a young mother from Louisiana, which she did not publish because she felt that it was absolutely, very, very radical and would not really be accepted in that sense by the society. So, here, I'd again like to discuss this with Professor Prakash, that here is this writer who is able to, understand the impulses of her own, life, and of the process of writing, I think, which is where she brings in women's experiences.
Yes, I think the point began with your describing her as the modern woman, or as a kind of representation of the modern woman that was emerging in the 19th century. Her year of birth is 1850, so she would be writing in the 1870s and 80s to begin with, and in 1904 she dies, so which means at the age of 54 she dies. And she is in touch with people like, through writing, people like Maupassant and this Russian writer, and Zola, this French writer, and Zola and Maupassant would not exactly be close to feminism, but this woman was perhaps taking the craft from there, and she was expressing the ethos of her own time in her home and in her surroundings. So still, the question is there whether a modern woman in the 19th century would be against tradition and orthodoxy, or whether she would have some specific qualities of her own. Is she reactive in the sense, that she rejects all that is there existing in the domain of woman's experience, or that she is giving also independent counter vision of a woman? So how does one take her as a modern woman?
When we look at, when we discuss the story of an hour in detail, we'll see that it's very difficult to take a clear position on Kate Chopin as a writer, to say that, she's expressing everything clearly or she's not, because there's a lot that she's hiding. Beneath the main plot, that is to say, which is why also even for the story of an hour, there is a lot of criticism that is extremely divergent, in its approach to the story, because there are people who are critical of Kate Chopin's position. There are critics who feel that there is self-assertion, yet there is a critic who for this story calls it fatal self-assertion, that there is a realization that probably this is not possible. But I think her craft lies in keeping everything at the subtextual level and allowing the reader to actually read between the lines. It's very important, I think, in a Kate Chopin text, for the reader to be able to see beyond what she's saying. So I think that is where, and she allows you, the text allows you to see
Actually,
beyond the
hiding is
level.
a very important aspect of writing.
Yes.
When you hide, then people become curious as to what you are hiding.
Yes.
And then they study you much more closely than they otherwise would. So she is not using statement, maybe she is using images, maybe she is talking tongue-in-cheek, maybe she is using a dialogue that has kind of double meaning, in the sense that other writers also might have used earlier. So the modern woman then is one who knows that she has to say something rebellious, and she doesn't want to show it. So that, I think, is the characteristic nature that emerges from your discussion of this. So that's the
Yes.
modern woman.
Yes.
She knows, she means what she has to say, and yet she will not let you know it directly.
And also, not only has she accepted that change and made it probably her own way of life, but she's also seeing it and is able to identify it as reflected in the lives of other women around her. So this is certainly what Chopin does. Since we are talking about the modern woman, it's important to also look at the modern woman in context of the America of the 1890s. A period of social change, a period of social tension. 1893 to 96 being the years of the depression. So this is a story that's written in 1894. So there is this tussle, in a sense, and a realization of the force of tradition that is there in society, that expects the women to behave in a certain manner, and there is modernity. So this was also the time of the implementation of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And this is, of course, despite the fact that after the Civil War there was great representation, of the Afro-Americans, and this is something that Margot Cully has pointed out. So we look at this very, very interesting phase, because the suffrage movement is also it is there, and there are two suffrage organizations that are formed close to where Chopin is. And her complete disdain for the institution of marriage, which is why she does not remarry, and she on one particular occasion tells one of the women that she meets, that she would never fall into the useless, degrading life of most married ladies. So there is, this criticism in a sense of marriage. And to quote Emily Toth here, who says that literary critics have long presented Kate Chopin as a detached, objective observer who rarely wrote from personal experience. What we are saying is quite the reverse, and so does Emily Toth say, and one completely agrees with her here. She says, but as I show in my biography, she drew on real life for most of her inspiration. In short stories, Chopin used the names of real people and revealed their secrets with only the thinnest of disguises. The disguises were all there, but these were, one could just immediately read beneath this. So, when one looks at this conflict, it is from this conflict of new impulses, change. We have the train, we have the suffrage movement, we have economic changes, and women are responding to all this. And Chopin uses the short story to express these contradictions. The Story of an Hour, written in 1894, was initially refused by one of the publishers, Richard Gilder, because it was believed that the story lacked ethical values. So if you look at the story, it's a really, really short story, just in almost about 1,000 words. There are so many turns in the story. There is so much that is happening. From start to end, everything changes. So the protagonist of the story here is Mrs. Mallard, and the very first sentence gives us, the theme, which is that her husband has died, and he's part of the railways, and there's been an accident, so the husband has died, and the news is, it's very gently revealed to Mrs. Mallard. Her sister Josephine, friend Richard, they are present to break the news as gently as possible, because she has a heart problem. And again, a very important point, how Kate Chopin is very conscious of the way in which women's identities are appropriated in marriage. So Mrs. Mallard, at least in the first part, is Mrs. Mallard, whereas we know the husband's name early on, he's Brentley Mallard. So now here, to quote from the story, she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. This statement itself raises a lot of questions. First and foremost, she does not accept this news with a kind of paralyzed inability, suggesting that otherwise women are absolutely paralyzed in this kind of a situation. So there is the term that, tells us that she's experiencing a wide range of emotions, is wild abandonment. And once the storm of grief is over, she wanted to be in a room alone and have no one follow her. She wanted to be by herself. So this is very characteristic, of Kate Chopin's style, that every sentence, really speaking, takes us through different phases. We can see, what the expectation of the society is from a woman in this kind of a situation, and yet here is this woman who's doing something else, who's doing something, that one might not expect her to do, and there are emotions and sentiments that she's experiencing all at once.
Professor Payal Nagpal, would you like to explain briefly the phrase wild abandonment? What exactly does it mean?
So over here, it's indicative of, as I said, there is grief, and there is a sudden surge. It's almost like a letting go of emotions, and my own, theory here would be that it's not only emotions related, in a sense, to the husband's death, but also to a complete letting go, and to seize that moment where she can express herself freely. Even if it is grief, she's expressing herself in a way that women are not expected to, especially, back in the 1890s.
What does wild indicate?
So while over here is, we have to look at it in, as I said, many different ways. Is she looking at freedom ahead? Is she looking at
Nature.
nature? I think over here it's more, it's not so much nature, but it's more of the fact that women are always expected to show a degree of poise. If we actually look at the 19th century, especially, interestingly, I think because of the suffrage movement, there are a series of manuals in the 1880s and 90s that instruct women to always behave properly. Here, the wild abandonment is also a rejection of any expected behavior and any normative behavior, so to say.
So wildness then is perhaps the need of the hour for the woman of the new kind in the latter half of the 19th century, and this is permissible and not permissible in the 19th century. That also is the case, as you pointed out, that there were people who would call her, not following ethical principles.
Yes, not permissible.
If that is the case, then the woman protests, and protests in such a manner that she expresses happiness of the wild kind, and the people can raise their eyebrows and she won't bother.
Yes, it's almost as if all this while she had been trained and tutored to behave in a certain way, and suddenly this is a moment that has given her the liberty in a sense to kind of express herself.
So friends, in this part of the lecture we have got a view of the writer Kate Chopin, one who is a part of society and one who is that part of society which doesn't agree with the larger construct called the social principles or the cultural principles, and that she is assertive in her own way. I say in her own way, and Professor Payal Nagpal has suggested this very clearly. In her own way means that she will say it and at the same time be very modest and subdued about it. But then the more subdued she is, the more vocal she becomes in her intent. So let's now think of the latter part of the lecture, and till then, when I request her to resume the lecture, thanks to you.